Lunch okay? Welcome back. Let's get started. It's with great pleasure for me to welcome Martin Landa, who's the Vice Mayor of Brno, to give a short talk. This will then be followed by an introduction by Dorothy Zemak, who will introduce Susan Holden, okay? Martin Landa, thank you.
Thank you. It's a really great pleasure for me to welcome you on Brno Center City District. I would like to welcome you here, and I would like you to find out we are really what you could be reading about in New York Times or Washington Post, the nightlife in Brno. We have good wine, good beer, so I hope you all enjoy that, the nightlife. But first of all, I would like to thank you. Thank you for the wonderful thing you are doing. You are bringing the chance to speak in foreign languages for many students. I'm one of them, and me coming to politics, I sort of set my boundaries, what I would like to say to people while giving speeches. I started 3 years ago giving the information about the exact time because I would like to speak to people about practical things. And if you are teachers, I would like to tell you my story, how I learned English. You can see I have a hard Slavic accent, and I am not able to get rid of it. I'm sorry I gave up, so I hope it doesn't hurt your ears too much. If so, you could try to focus on some other things. But the experience I'm having, I learned English the hard way. Like I learned also a German language. We are close to Vienna. My grandparents had a TV, so I could watch Knight Rider and Star Trek. So this is how I learned. Yeah, thank you. This is how I learned foreign languages. Even after the Velvet Revolution, we had to learn from the English book about Prokop family, which was a weird family having weird hobbies, traveling to Eastern Germany. We couldn't see why we would learn stuff like that. Now my kids are 7 and 9. They speak almost without accent. It's annoying because they are learning the wow English, so if you know the songs and stuff, it's also hurting my ears, but people like our kids, they love it, they speak English, and it's a wonderful thing. I really would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart that you are bringing advanced, not technologies, but advanced ways how to spread the word, how to make learning and understanding English easier or other languages, because it's a wonderful thing. And in our globalized world, if we can understand each other, we can share experiences, culture differences, we can speak about lots of stuff. It wouldn't be possible if we wouldn't be able to speak other languages. Maybe for us, like who experienced the communist era, it's like a miracle, really. So that's why I'm especially thankful for your energy you are putting in this field of like bringing the language to other people. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Martin Landa. Dorothy.
This is going to be a very short introduction because I know Susan is also going to talk about herself, so she knows herself better than I do. But I met Susan, I think 2 years ago, was it, in Brazil at a conference, and we got to talking, and I thought, here's one of my tribe. She's an author and a publisher, so she has a wealth of understanding about materials, which is something I'm very interested in, how they're created and how they come about. And I was at one point at this conference saying, well, I've had the longest trip to get here because I got up at 4:10 a.m. on Monday morning and arrived in Brno Tuesday afternoon. But Susan took, what did we say, 30 hours 30 hours to get here too. She came from Scotland, but she drove. She drove from Scotland, including a night ferry. That's dedication. So, over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much. My friends say crazy, not dedication. Anyway, it is very, very nice to be here. Good. Very nice to be here. I was here 2 years ago at the first of the symposiums, the first of these events. How many of you were here at the event 2 years ago? Okay. Not many of us, about a quarter of us. What I thought I would do in this session is do a little bit of looking back and a little bit of looking forward. And to explain why I'm doing this, as Dorothy said, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I've been around a long time, working in English language teaching in various fields. I was originally trained at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London to teach drama and English in UK schools, so to primary and secondary students. And the very first thing we had to do in the first week was spend our Saturday morning going to London Zoo. I thought, this is really strange. Am I really in the right place to be doing something that I want to do for my life? We were told to choose an animal, any animal, and to observe it for 3 hours. And we could make notes. It was before the days of smartphones, so we couldn't take photographs using a phone. This is all historical. And when we went back, we had to present our animal without any explanation, no words. We had to present our animal to the rest of the course. When my tutor explained this to me, I thought, this is totally crazy. You know, what is this place? But it was absolutely fascinating, because I found that by looking at something and observing it and listening and smelling in some cases and seeing what that thing, in this case an animal, was, and then having to project that, select the important things and project that to other people, was actually very useful. Because one of the other things we had to do in our 3-year course was go into London schools and observe lessons. We then went in and did practice teaching. And I'm not saying that kids in London were exactly the same as the animals in London Zoo, but the task was very similar. And any of you who have been involved in observing lessons know that when you see a teacher interacting with a class, when you see learners interacting with each other, or not, looking out of the window, thinking about what they really would like to be doing, as a teacher trainer, that tells you a lot about the teacher, the connections with the class, and so on. So for me, through my life, observing, listening and looking and making notes, and above all, thinking, has been a very, very important part of my life, which, as I say, has gone on for quite a long time. Those of you who were here last year may remember, I hope you got, a copy of a book written by Peter Medges from Budapest called The Non-Native Teacher, which I was the publisher of. The reason I mention that is that, like Dorothy, I'm both a publisher and an author. Lots of other things too. But it's quite an interesting thing to do, because you see two sides of the same thing, whether it's a book or whether it's a profession, from two different angles. And sometimes, if you're doing what I do now, I used to work in big publishing. I was the managing director of Macmillan ELT for many years. I now work for my own company. It has one person working for it, which is me. So I talk to myself a lot. I curse myself. I say, why on earth can you be doing such stupid things? And I had an experience last year of actually publishing something that I had written. And this caused me to think a great deal. It caused me to think about teaching today. What do we mean when we talk about teaching today? What are the contexts in which teaching is going on? What are our priorities? And what are the concerns that we have as individuals? And that's what I thought I would frame the talk on today. I get this right? We might be stuck with that. Help, help. Ah, it does help, doesn't it? Have a green light. Yeah. Okay, context, priorities and concerns. Are they positive? Are they negative? Or are they challenging? And that leads one to ask a lot of questions about what are we doing? What are we doing in the classroom? What are our trainees doing in the classroom? What are the readers of the methodology books that we write doing? What are the users of course material doing? Why are they there? What do they want to get out of the experience? And the thing that triggered my thinking about all this was being asked to revise something that I had first written in 2009. Now, 2009 is 10 years ago. I'll ask you just for a second, all of you, to think what you were doing 10 years ago. Not necessarily in the language classroom, just in life. You know, we're people as well as teachers. Just think back 10 years. Well, because I was rewriting a book, I focused this on teaching, learning, and using English. And I asked myself a huge number of questions about teaching and training. Why are we teaching English? Who are we teaching? Why are we training teachers? Why are we perhaps being trained ourselves? And above all, who are our learners? What do they actually want to get out of the experience? Because when I wrote the original edition of the book in 2009, the world was a different place. When I wrote the very first edition of the book in something like 1990, the world was a totally different place. And just to focus on that, I'd asked you to think about yourselves as language learners. Can you think when you began learning English, and if you're a native speaker of English, when you began learning any other language? Hopefully all of us have learned another language. Why did you begin learning? What were your objectives? What did you want to get out of it? When were you doing this? Where were you learning? And how were you doing it? So good old WH questions. Just a second to think about this. You as learners. And if anybody would like to tell us, that would be very good. Any offers? To start you off, I started learning French. I learnt French in school because I had to. If it was 9:20 on Monday morning, it was maths. If it was 10:20, it was French. My objectives were to kind of get through school, I guess, and, you know, come out the other end. Didn't really have any objective in learning French. I was doing it at school, and I continued doing it because I actually liked the French teacher. We had a very good French teacher, and so, as a result, I think, I was actually quite good at French. I also learnt German. After 3 years, we were allowed to choose a second language. I wanted to do Spanish. The head teacher said, "No, Susan, it doesn't fit into the timetable. You will learn German." I said, "I want to learn Spanish." She said, "No, Susan, you will learn German." So I did German for 2 years. The teacher and I disliked each other intensely. And I think, in fact, I know, German was the only subject I failed when I did my O-level exams. So the personal involvement with the language is, I think, quite important. Anybody like to offer any examples?
Hello, my name is Saadet Akıncı. That's a difficult name for you because I'm from Turkey. Currently, I'm living in Istanbul and teaching English to all ages for all purposes because with my experience of 35 years of English, I've met lots of students who need English for different purposes, like from academic exams to beginners levels in the beginning, now academic purposes, etc. Now, what about me? Why did I begin learning English? It was just because it was my mother's ambition to learn a foreign language, but she could not realize it due to the economic reasons, let's say, of the times she was a student. And she wanted her children, my brother and me, to learn. Why mom? Because my father didn't care much about my learning a foreign language, but my mother was very ambitious. So she forced, plus, of course, paid for this education, which I had at a, but private school, starting at the age of 7. So it was my mother's ambition, not mine, because I was only 6. And what were my objectives? Until 11, my objectives, like all the children, involved enjoying what we were doing because it was mainly songs, alphabet, stories, etc., games. But my objectives changed, and I became more aware of them when I was at the age of 11 or 12, when we moved to a building, apartment building, which had like 32 flats in English, apartments in American, which accommodated like 28 American families who were based in Ankara, because I'm from the capital, and who had come to this base, American base. Was it Just Met or something like that? It was a long time ago. I don't think any of you remember those times. You're very young. And lived there with their families. So at the age of 12, my objective became as communicating with the children first, and then the parents, and then enjoying the language because I was able to communicate and translate when among the Turkish families and the Americans. So that was quite enjoyable as a child of 11, 12, and then babysitting the American children, playing with them, and then reading the magazines, which we could not get hold of, which existed in these houses, all these American magazines. I remember True Confessions, for example, trying to understand what the adult life was about. And at school, of course, we were studying English at, let's say, A2, B1 level when I was 11, 12. And I was learning all this at home, I mean in the building where we were living, plus school where speaking our native language, Turkish, was forbidden in the English classes. Our English teachers were always around, listening to us, even in the ladies' rooms. And if they caught us, we were supposed to pay. We were fined for speaking Turkish, in the classroom especially. So by force, we spoke English at school, plus at home in an enjoyable way. And I was doing it by reading, playing games, communicating with the Americans, reading lots of books at school, especially the readers, the graded readers by Longman. Sorry. That was, I think, the only publisher in those times. We had not met Cambridge or other publishers yet. because I'm quite old. I'm not saying how old. And we were really enjoying all those readers as well because they were suitable for our age. And of course, our teachers always. And I really loved the language because I learned it from childhood. Nobody forced me. It helped me to communicate. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much. And a very unusual example, thinking back a few decades probably, to mother's influence, not the school influence, the political situation in Europe with American troops here and so on and so forth. So quite an unusual one. Would anybody else like to offer their own? Okay, well, we've thought about learners. What about teaching? Think about when you first began teaching English, if you can. Not quite so far back, probably. And again, the same kind of questions. Why did you begin teaching English? If you can remember. What were your objectives? When were you doing this? Where were you teaching? And how were you doing it? Dorothy? Yeah.
So in university, I majored in French literature with no thought as to what I would do with that. And then I graduated, and I didn't know what to do. So I opened the newspaper, because back then we had newspapers, and that's where all the help wanted ads were. And I was kind of going through them, could I do this, could I do that? And there was one that said, teach English in Japan, call, and there was a phone number. And I called, and went for the interview, and at least I had background in learning a foreign language, and I was strong in English, and I got hired. Between the time that I was hired and the time my plane landed, the person who hired me had sold the school. So somebody else met me at the airport who had not hired me. He had just inherited me, and he came up, shook my hand, another American guy, and the first thing he said was, I just hope you're normal. Because he'd had some not normal experiences. So my objectives were, I mean, it was my first job out of university. My objective was to earn some money and support myself and have a job. So I was doing that in 1986, I want to say, probably, so right out of college. I was teaching in Narita, Japan, where the airport is, so about an hour and a half outside of Tokyo. How? The person who just wanted me to be normal was such a good teacher trainer. I had a day to observe classes, and then I was teaching the next day, but he also enrolled me in the chapter of the Japan Language Association, and he drove us every month, so we never missed a meeting. And there were such good teacher trainers, and every month I would get 3 hours of really practical stuff. I could turn around and use it in the classroom. And Japanese students are, at least in their behavior, they're very accepting. They'll try anything once. So you have room to experiment and to grow. And from that, I renewed for another year and then got my master's and came back and did a total of 5 years in Japan. And that was me.
Thanks very much. Okay, let us move on to training. How many of you are involved in training other people to be teachers? Okay. And are any of you being trained at the moment? Are you on the receiving end of a training course? So we've got trainers, but not trainees here. And the question, which I will go on to, is training other people. Why did you begin thinking of training other people to teach English? You've learnt English, you've become a teacher, for whatever reason, maybe money, maybe interest, maybe political possibilities and so on. But now you've decided to train other people. Why? What's the purpose in that? Anybody like to offer? Share your secrets. You're a bold person.
Thank you. I personally had a wonderful trainer. I met a person at a conference like this many, many years ago. She was so inspiring that I decided on the spot to go into training. And I've been there ever since. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, I mean, we are all very impressed, affected by other people. And the reason I ask these questions is that I think it's very easy, whether you're learning, whether you're teaching, whether you're teacher training, whether you're producing materials, as Dorothy and I do, it's very easy to go on kind of doing the same thing without asking yourself questions. And one of the things with all those questions, of course, is that you could and should be asking them about learners, teachers, teacher trainers now. Because I referred to having to go back to 2009 and a bit further back than that when I was revising this. And as I started revising, I thought, but my goodness, Susan, the world is a different place from 10 years ago. If I'm writing something that I hope trainee teachers and teachers will use in the next 5 or 10 years, I've got to think forwards as well as back. And it seems to me that wherever we're teaching, whoever we're training, we need to be analysing the people, analysing the context in which we're teaching, trying to find what our objectives are, and above all, our users' objectives. And this seems to me to be more and more difficult, because we're living at a time, and this applies specifically to English. I often wish my native language was not English. I know this is hypocrisy, but we have the disadvantage, those of us who were kind of born speaking English, we have a disadvantage that our language is now a global language. It's used all over the world. I say a disadvantage because it's very difficult to know what is right and wrong. And if you're a teacher, you've probably been trained to correct, to assess, to find out what is right and what is wrong, to help your students not make mistakes, to help your students pass exams. And if you're dealing with a subject matter that is shifting daily, which exists in one form in a course book, the course book that you're probably using, and in a different form out there in the real world, as a teacher, it's very difficult. What's correct? If my students can communicate perfectly well using social media, if they can walk down the street and see funny uses of English or funny things in a restaurant menu and so on, who am I to say they're wrong? And if I, as a non-native speaker of English, if I hear my students using English or see them using English in a way that, according to my training, is not correct, what do I do? Do I correct them? Perhaps my English is wrong too. And that's why I say it's actually very difficult teaching your own language if that language is shifting all the time. Now, there are quite a lot of other native speakers here in the room. Have I spoken heresy? Does anybody disagree with that? Yes, good. I like a bit of a debate. What? You don't? Right. This is a negative-minded native speaker. I'll come back to you. Right. Your point of view is just as valid. One of the preoccupations at the moment, and there are many preoccupations which I think are governing what we're doing, one of the preoccupations at the moment is the rise of English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, English which doesn't use native speaker models, but concentrates on communication and being understood. Now, have any of you read much or attended seminars or webinars on English as a lingua franca? ELF. Well, it's sort of in the air. If you go on Facebook, if you look at webinars, it's quite difficult to escape it at the moment. Now, I have an interest in this because, as I say, one of the books I published was Peter Medges' non-native teacher book. Medges Peter is a Hungarian. I first met him 1991 when I was publisher at Macmillan then, and this unknown Hungarian sent me the idea for a book about the problem of the non-native teacher of English in the context of native speaker teachers of English. Now, the timing is important. I mentioned with you politics, the world outside, one of the things that framed your learning of English. Peter was writing in the early 90s. I'm sure you remember what happened in 1989. Something came down. Exactly. And this part of the world changed, didn't it? You know, there were opportunities, there were problems, there were challenges, and so on. It depends on your generation, how much you remember of this or have heard about it. But Peter was very, very conscious as a Hungarian that suddenly in Hungary, where, as here in the Czech Republic, and in Slovakia, and in Poland, and East Germany, there were a lot of very well-trained non-native speaker teachers who understood their educational context, understood the educational aims. They were being surpassed by a flood of backpackers, young people largely from Britain, but not only. I think there were probably quite a lot of Australians and Americans and so on, who could sell themselves as native speakers of English, which they were. They had had no training at all, but if you were running a language institute, employing that person became very, very attractive, because you could say, hey, I've got native speaker teachers, and you could put up your fees, and there began to be a sort of rift between the well-trained local teachers of the language, was mostly English, but not only English, German and French a little bit to some degree, and these backpackers, untrained. And Peter wrote this book in the early 90s about this. And being a diplomatic person, he was actually Hungary's ambassador to Syria, which always makes me smile for some time. Being a diplomatic person, he basically said, the world needs both of us. You know, if you and I are working in a school, you can help me in some ways, I can help you in other ways, and working together makes a lot of sense. Team teaching, or even just discussion in the teacher's room, makes a lot of success. And we published this book in the early 90s, and it became a kind of set book on training courses in a lot of countries in the world. And then something Dorothy and I may touch on tomorrow, the publishing world is a fairly aggressive world where companies buy up and take on other companies. And sadly, the bit of Macmillan that I ran was sold to, sorry Dorothy, an American publisher who said, publishing for Central Europe? No, Susan, absolutely no way. You don't want to go there. And Peter's book went out of print. And I hadn't forgotten about it because I went on doing a lot of things in this part of the world. But 3-4 years ago, I happened to be in Brazil. I've done a lot of work in Latin America. And the British Council there had done a survey among Brazilian teachers of their attitudes to teaching. And I curse myself that I didn't ask for a copy of the survey, and inevitably they don't have it any longer. But they'd asked the question of the Brazilian teachers, who is the ideal teacher? It's a question a bit like that. I can't remember the exact wording. And now I've spent a lot of time in Brazil. I've sat in state schools, up the Amazon, in remote parts where teachers really have very little English, but sometimes are wonderful teachers because they understand their students, they can communicate with them, they can focus on what they need. And the answer the British Council told me to the question, who is the ideal teacher of English, was, can you guess? A native speaker of English. And I thought, this is crazy. Because I'm not saying all Brazilian teachers are wonderful. You know, there are good ones and bad ones, as there are in any country. But I thought, this is so uninformed. And this attitude that if I'm a native speaker of the language, whatever my other qualifications, or lack of them are, I can have a better salary and a better job than somebody else. There's something wrong here. And that was certainly going on in Brazil. Language institutes were advertising the fact that on their training courses, their teaching courses, they had native speakers. Well, we all, you know, I'm sure you all know, very good native speaker teachers, very bad ones, and the same with non-native. And I happened to be in Budapest just after that and met Peter, and we did have several glasses of Hungarian wine and decided we should reissue the book. And that forced Peter to look back at something that he had written 15 years before. And for me as the publisher, I was wearing my publisher hat at that point. In other words, the person who had to find the money to produce the book and get it reviewed and get it into people's hands. That forced me to look at the world and see the way it was going and ask the question, is it worth doing? And then it forced Peter to have to think, do I change the content? Now, does anybody here know Medjes Peter by any chance? Yes, okay. Good. He's wonderful, but he is also quite rigid. He's quite difficult to persuade to do things. And he said, no, Susan. A lot of this was by email. No, Susan, I'm not changing it. What I wrote then is true now. Because again, there's all this native, non-native teacher split. I said, 1990 was a long time ago. Some of the language, some of the references need changing. And I went to Budapest maybe 3 times in about 3 months to discuss with my author about changing it. In the end, we had a compromise. I have a good friend, and Peter respects very much, somebody called Sheila Rickson, who used to work for the British Council and used to work at the University of Warwick. And Peter said, you ask Sheila, whatever she said, we'll go for. And Sheila said, don't change the text, but add questions to it. Get teachers who are reading the text to try and relate what Peter said to their own context, their own preoccupations, their own objectives, and use the text as a point of discussion. And that, I thought, was an excellent compromise, and that is actually what we did. And anybody who knows the book will know that in the margins there are questions and discussion points. It's not saying Medjes is right, it's saying, or implying, Medjes says this, what do you think? Would this work in your context? You know, and how about you? Take this further. And this is underlining the point of what I'm trying to say this afternoon, which is that I think every time we talk about teaching, every time we talk about training, we need to go back to the people involved. We need to look at the specific people. And if you're teaching business English, anybody teaching business English? Okay. Now, the people who are going to use English for business are probably going to use it in an international context. They're probably going to be communicating with people of other nationalities, people from other cultures. And tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my perception is it's not what you say in a business context that is always the most important. It's how you say it, how you behave. Would anybody want to challenge that? Or, I mean, don't agree with everything I'm saying. Come on, Mike. No? Okay. Because I don't think we realize until we start traveling ourselves, until we start using our language in other contexts, how rooted language is in our own cultures. And I don't mean the Tower of London and the Queen and all that stuff. I mean how we behave. Now, I travel quite a lot. I've lived in Italy for 9 years. I go a lot to France. Every time I go to France, I go and meet friends or I go to a conference and I greet somebody and I think, oh my God, I'm going to have to kiss her. Now, is it right, left, right? How many times? Twice, 3 times. And if you go to Brazil, you never stop kissing people. Every morning when you go to a book exhibition, you're being greeted again. Now, to a British person, and I don't think of myself as very British, but to a British person, you know, you hold out your hand and you stay as far away from the person as you possibly can. So to be suddenly engulfed by somebody you don't know is a bit strange. I'm exaggerating, obviously. But again, in terms of formality of language, in the business context, how you write an email, how you respond to an email. I can remember, and it is some time ago, one of the first times I got an email from somebody I didn't know in a business context who started, "Hi, Susan." "Hi? Susan? We haven't been introduced. Come on." And to know the formality of writing an email is actually as important as whether you make the formality of writing an email is as important as whether you make a linguistic mistake, according to me. So business English should, I think, include some kind of cultural awareness. Very easy to say that, but if you're producing a textbook for business English or for adult learners or for people who are going to use English in a global context, well, what do you use as your model? This question was asked me by a teacher, some teachers in Switzerland last year. There was a native speaker of English who used her own production of English as the pronunciation model for her students. All the other teachers, or most of the other teachers in the group, were French. Wonderful English, but French English, as you would expect. And she, this very dogmatic, rather elderly lady, maintained that only a native speaker of the language could provide the right model, production model, for the students. Obviously, diplomatically, that was actually a bit difficult. The French teachers were very, very polite, and I, being trying to find a compromise, fell back on, yes, I understand, but we all have recorded material, so if you're not sure about your own English for production, then why not use recorded material? Use the CD, use the digital material as the model. And they seemed happy with that, and it was okay. I then thought, again, when I was revising this, I thought, come on, Susan, that was a pretty much a non-answer. Go into publisher mode. You're involved with the author or authors in producing a textbook. You want to have listening material that teachers can use in the class. Receptively, it's quite easy, because in a global world, it's great if students here can hear Japanese English, Brazilian English, Chinese English, Portuguese English, all the Englishes that there are, to respond to. That's preparing them for reality. But if you think of production, they've got to have something to act as a model. Now, I don't care, when I was first involved in textbook publishing, I always felt the division between, is it British English or is it American English, was a bit false on many occasions. I don't actually care whether my students are using Dorothy as a production model or me as a production model. I don't think I care, but no, I don't care. But you've got to provide something. And as a teacher, I think this concentration of anything goes, the pronunciation doesn't matter. Fine you know, if that's what you believe for understanding. But you've got to help your students to produce something. And if they're going to be evaluated, if they're going to be tested in what they're doing, then obviously you as a teacher have a responsibility, even if you disagree with it, you fight outside, but you've got a responsibility to make sure that they can come up with a kind of pronunciation that an exam board or testers would be looking for. So as a teacher, it seems to me all the time, teacher, and I use the word teacher globally to include teacher trainers, it seems to me we have to focus on the individuals, and we also have to focus on the context in which we're teaching them, but also where they're going to use the language in the world outside. And in order to do that, we have to look at the world outside, we have to look at our users, try and analyze what they need, and think how we can help them. Any comments or questions on that? Because that's far too much of me. No? Okay. Well, I've mentioned English as a lingua franca, and what I wanted to do just before, I've decided to abandon that, by the way, so you won't get any more goodies there. Well, maybe right at the end. I've touched on English as a lingua franca as one of the preoccupations for a lot of teachers at the moment, and I think probably for anybody involved in teacher training. What do I do about it? I mean, you'll probably have gathered from my comments that I'm fairly broad-minded about these things, and basically, as long as it works, do it. But there are other problems. What is the age at which children are beginning to learn English here in the Czech Republic? First of all, in mainstream education. 8. And is that the same in Hungary? I'm not sure. 7, 8, yeah. Okay, 7, 8, which is what it was when I was teaching in Italy. How about in the private language sector, in private language schools? What age do they begin? Kindergarten. How old is kindergarten? 3. Okay. Any advance on 3? Any 2-year-olds? I'm sure there are somewhere. 1.5. Yeah, okay. It's going down, isn't it? Yeah, it'll be sort of pre-birth pretty soon. This is happening all over the world. I mean, when I first started teaching in Italy, in fact, students learned a foreign language at Scuola Media at 11 plus. And then there was a lot of discussion about bringing it down. And as with a lot of Ministry of Education decisions, you know, the decision was made without always thinking of the implications. Like, you know, who's going to teach it? Because in Italy, you have primary school up to the age of 11, and then you have 11 to 14 middle school, and then you have upper secondary. Okay, they had trained teachers to teach in secondary, but the ministry says, as from September, waving a magic wand, we're going to do foreign languages in third year of elementary. We don't have teachers. In the primary school, we have class teachers, as we do in Britain. They teach all subjects, but a lot of them don't know any English. So again, there was a rush of teacher training for that and so on. Okay, that kind of settled down, steadied itself, and then probably, I think about 6, 7 years ago, in most countries I've been to, in the private sector, parents suddenly realizing that English is a useful thing because it's an international language, I might be able to help my child to be a success in the future if I enroll him or her at the age of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 in a language institute. Very often for admirable reasons. You know, I want to help my child. I want to help my child get ahead or give them an advantage in life. And if I've got enough money, I'll pay for it. But the implications of that, educationally, I think are actually very serious. And it worries me a great deal. Again, perhaps because I spend quite a bit of time in Brazil, where it goes to real extremes. Because has anybody here ever tried to teach a language to a 4-year-old? Tried to. how was it for you and the student? Yeah. They're different. You can't do the same things that you do with an 8-year-old. You know, try and imagine any 3-4-year-old that you know, of any nationality, reading, writing, communication, yeah? How do you communicate with that child, those children, if you don't, as a teacher, if you don't speak their language? Now, one of the reasons I learned Italian very quickly was that I was working in, when I first went there, I was working in an international house in Latina, and I was given, because I'd been trained to teach properly in school, I was given the kids, the primary students to look after, and I realized that my problem was not dealing with the children. I think I got on fairly well with them, but it was dealing with the parents, because the parents would come to the school, and the parents, on the whole, didn't speak any English, and they would want to speak to the class teacher, saying, you know, why on earth are my children only learning to play games and do songs or whatever it is, when, you know, learning a language is about learning the grammar and the vocabulary. And this pushed me to learn Italian, so that's my byproduct out of that. But joking apart, I think what worries me is an assumption, and I've seen it in some British Council material, I've seen it in some textbook material, that teaching a 3-4-year-old is like teaching a 7-8, but, you know, with a few more songs and games and so on. And psychologically, a child of that age is very, very different. They need to communicate with each other. They need to be able to come and tell the teacher about the wonderful thing they did with their granny at the weekend and this awful disaster that's hit their home. And the communication between the children and between the teacher is actually a key part of learning that language, it seems to me. Because if it goes wrong, it'll be, as Alan has said, a kind of negative experience for everybody. And I think somehow parents have to have it explained to them that, okay, it may work, you may be buying something very good for your child, but ask a lot of questions. Find out about the teacher. Is the teacher actually trained to teach primary? The language, and this may be heresy in a language symposium, but for me, the language is the least part of it. It's the communication, the understanding, and the educational objectives of the teacher and the organization. Anybody want to disagree with that? Or agree? I am exaggerating, I may say.
Thank you. My name is Ola Kowada, and I've been teaching preschool children for the last 10 years. And I'm also teacher trainer, so I help teachers to teach little kids. And I totally agree with what you said, that parents do not always understand how the process takes place. So when I work with kids, with little pre-primary, like nowadays I teach 4-year-olds, I always imagine that I have 2 students, the 4-year-old and his or her parents. So the different job is what I do in my classroom with the little ones, but when the lesson finishes, I always spend a few minutes with parents, and I explain what we did, what the children were doing, how we communicated, and then I've got parent support, and they understand what is happening. And then they've got different opinion about the course, and they can support the child at home. And what I need from them is to let the children watch, for example, English stories or cartoons in English, so that the children hear the foreign language as well also at home, yeah? So I really believe that it makes sense to teach children, but you have to involve parents. Yeah, thank you.
No, I totally agree. Involve the parents. And so anybody involved in teacher training who is training potential teachers at the primary level, I think needs to be aware of this. You know, find out about children, find out about child psychology, attend some courses yourself. You know, the English is only part of it. I've covered quite a large range, and the underlying message of all this, I think, is look at the people. Think about the trainees. Think about yourself as a teacher. Think about your learners. Then think about the world outside, which is changing. Think how your learners are going to use the language in the world outside, and how can you bridge the gap between what may be the education system, if you're working in a full-time education system, what the education system requires, which in many countries, I don't know enough, I'm out of date on the Czech Republic, but in many countries hasn't kept up with the developments in the real use of English in the real world. How can you square that as a teacher or a would-be teacher with what the education system is demanding and what you want to do with your students? As a trainer, how can you raise awareness, not saying correct English, whatever that is no good, is not necessary, but think of it in the wider context. When somebody uses the phrase English as a lingua franca or global English, what does it actually mean? Where's the culture in communication? I mentioned the obvious stupid thing of going to how you greet people in France. As an example of somebody who is a pretty seasoned traveller. I don't only spend my time driving from Scotland to Brno, but I do travel a lot. And I spent 7 years on and off doing various projects in Brazil. My Portuguese and understanding is pretty good. Spoken, it tends to change into Italian or French mid-sentence. Anyway, as an example of cultural misunderstanding, even if you think you know your way around, I was flying to a conference from the southwest of Brazil to the northeast. And anybody who can look at the map or has been there knows that Brazil is a very large country. It's like Europe. And I arrived at a conference place in Recife at something like 2 o'clock in the morning after 2 flights, which hadn't been very good. I went to the hotel to check in. Imagine yourself off a flight. You know, you feel tired. Your luggage has arrived, thank goodness, but you didn't really expect it to be there. You go to the hotel. I went to the hotel, and I said to the guy on the desk, I think I said it in Portuguese, good evening. I said, I have a reservation. He said, name. I said, Holden, very clearly, with an H, which I usually add, on the computer. No reservation. 3 o'clock in the morning. You've been on 2 flights all the time. I said, yes, reservation. I could feel my voice getting more and more British, Southern English. I'm usually quite nice traveling, but I was feeling quite nasty. I said, yes, reservation. He said, no reservation. I said, yes. He said, passport. So I gave him my passport, thinking, oh, God, I'm going to have to go and sleep on the beach or something. He keyed in my name, looked at the computer screen, and smiled at me and said, Susan. And what I had forgotten, even for a regular visitor to Brazil, that in Brazil they tend to use the first name first. If you go and register for a conference, I have to remember, if I register for a conference in Brazil and it's A to M and N to Z, I have to go to N to Z because the names are listed by first names, and Susan is in the second part, and Holden is in the other. Now, this sounds silly. It sounds flippant. It's kind of a funny story. But if you actually think of the real world of global English, if you think of business travelers, if you think of people who are going into business meetings, having lost their luggage or after an all-night flight or something, it's the behavior that helps or stops the communication. And it seems to me that that really is what needs to be underlying all the teaching and the training that we're doing. So I've gone off at a slight tangent, actually quite a tangent, but the underlying message was think about the people, analyze the people, and then decide what you want to do. James tells me I have 2 minutes left. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Very nice.
Thank you.